Our next section is going to be on the subject of runovers and backovers. But before I get started, let me add a couple things about this course. We started out with the concept of this being an awareness course. And there's all kinds of disclaimers that it's not a substitute for the OSHA 10-hour course, et cetera, et cetera. Time and volume have made this a much more comprehensive course depending on how you want to use it. You could use it in an awareness course. You could use it as a very substantive training course for however many hours you want to do it. Many people adopt from this to use significant parts in an OSHA 10-hour course or probably a 30-hour course. It is good for, obviously, directly for workers. It's excellent for supervisors. It's terrific for safety people. And you can spin it in many different ways. And you can use the modules, as we point out, in many different ways. But it does have a very wide-ranging versatility, and that's really one of its pluses. At this point, we're going to get into the runovers and backovers, and Scott Snyder will pick up on that project.
Okay, thanks, Don. As I said earlier, when we were looking at expanding this course from more of an awareness course, we decided we wanted to expand the night work module and also the module on runovers and backovers, because we have probably, we estimate about 30 construction workers every year that are killed mostly by being run over and backed over by construction equipment. It's equal to, if not greater than, the number of people that are killed by traffic, number of construction workers that are killed by traffic. So we developed an extensive module called Runovers, Backovers Plus that goes over what are the basic hazards of being run over and backed over, how do we avoid them, how do we protect workers. And so I'm going to show you the beginning of this module, and then Emmett Russell from the operating engineer is going to show you the end of it. So the first slide here, we talk about workers being struck on foot, that there are workers that are killed by motorists, but there are also workers killed by construction vehicles in the work zone. Oops. Yeah, why don't you do it? Okay, so here are some of the data that we have. 63% of road worker deaths are backovers and runovers, and half of those are by construction vehicles, primarily dump trucks, whereas the rest are vehicles traveling through the work zone, intruding into the workspace, etc. Next. Okay, why is this? Well, you know, we have very congested work sites, expedited work schedules, very cramped workspaces. We're working on existing roads, and there's more work zones. There's tens of thousands of them, and many of them, although we work a lot at night, there are a lot during peak construction hours as well. So what are the problems for motorists? You know, many of them are not aware, they're paying attention to the signs and to the barricades. They may not see workers or be surprised by work zone setups. And frankly, I think there's a lot of work zone setups that are not properly set up as well, unfortunately. And, you know, motorists have more distractions. I mean, as much as we pass laws against driving when you're on your cell phone, even if you have a hands-free cell phone, it's a distraction. Distracted by handheld devices, by radios, by CD players, by kids in the car. They can be drunk or drowsy, or etc. And of course, you know, it's no surprise that there's a lot of speeding going on, even in work zones, much to our chagrin. Workers sometimes stray into the traffic space, particularly when you don't have positive barriers in place, when you just have barrels and cones. They may be preoccupied with their work, trying to get it done properly and quickly. They may not appreciate the risks. They may think that, you know, motorists are going to see them, and they may not be as visible. They may be bending over doing something. Also, sometimes the work zones are not set up properly to give people proper access to rest areas, to shady areas, to food, to drink, to restrooms, to their cars. when they have to leave and come to work. So how do we prevent this from happening? Well, one of the ways you do it is having proper setup of the work zone itself. And obviously the MUTCD is clearly, the best guide. The thing we have to start with is setting it up according to the MUTCD. We do show a little demonstration which is about how to set up and retrieve these traffic control devices in the proper order, so that you're doing it so you have the least exposure to traffic. And particularly if the traffic control setup is not set up properly, it gets disrupted in some way, it's important to notify your supervisor and make sure, have the supervisor make sure that it gets fixed as quickly as possible. And it's important for the supervisor to drive the work zone and make sure periodically, because these cones and barrels do get knocked out of position on a regular basis. We've talked in many of these modules about visibility and the importance of visibility, so I'm not going to go into detail about this. We talk about some of the other important things for them not to stand in areas where they may not be so visible, like in shadows or over the crest of a hill, etc. So we're not going to really go into some of the demonstrations here, but they're very similar to the ones we had before. It's important for workers to stay in protected areas. If possible, if there's positive protection like jersey barriers, to stay on the work side of the barrier. This is one of the ways. For example, we've been promoting the use of these automated flagging devices now, so the worker can stay behind the protected barrier, and you can have the slow stop paddle closer to the traffic. To stay away from open traffic lanes, to talk with others only when they're in a safe area away from traffic, and get in and out of vehicles on the non-traffic side, have an emergency escape route, which is important, and to park their personal vehicles where there is safe access to and from the work zone. Okay, and I mentioned before this idea about internal traffic control plans, and this is where we actually show people how that works. And you can click on these two demonstrations. One of them, first one, sort of takes you to a booklet, and I think we actually have copies of this booklet in the back. We brought some. It's a booklet that you can download off of the Work Zone Clearinghouse website that sort of explains the basic philosophy and practice about how do you develop an internal traffic control plan, basically to guide vehicles through the work zone itself, not around it as we do with the traffic, to provide areas that are just for vehicle traffic and areas that are just for pedestrians. And we show that in the booklet and talk about how do you develop the diagram. And you can see that in the second demonstration. You can see here's a typical internal traffic control plan developed for a highway job. And it shows you the route of the traffic, route of the vehicles, and how they come in. And they just have those small shaded areas where backing up occurs. Okay, let's go back. And once you develop this plan, it's not enough just to develop it. You have to make sure that everybody knows about the plan and workers are trained to make sure that it's followed, that they're only walking in the pedestrian areas and not in the traffic areas. And you have to make sure that everybody that comes on the job site actually gets a copy of the plan and knows where they're supposed to drive and where they're not supposed to drive. Next. And lastly, we talk a little bit about how to be safe around equipment, about how to keep away from the swinging radius of vehicles, how to never enter those spaces unannounced, make sure that the driver acknowledges you before you approach a vehicle, and to communicate with the operator using radios or hand signals, and then never assume that the operator sees you until you have to make sure that you get an acknowledgement from the operator. So speaking of operators, I'm going to turn it over to Emmett Russell, who's the Safety Director for the Operating Engineers Union.
Thank you, Scott. Now we're going to talk about being crushed by equipment. And basically, there's a number of rules. We talk about lockout, tagout, always secure equipment, avoid pinch points, and around equipment you should not wear loose-fitting clothing. And again, you can get into a lot more details when you're actually training with the program, but clearly you can see where the program brings up all of the important points that you should be training on. Next. Okay, here's a couple of really good demos talking about blind spots. Okay, demo 1. For instance, it gives you a number of pieces of equipment where we can actually talk about the blind spot. For instance, this truck. If you look in the first square, you're actually seeing what the truck driver sees at the ground level. Okay, the shaded area would be the area that he cannot see at the ground level. The yellow area would be the areas that he can actually see through his mirror. In the second slot, this would be the area he would see roughly at a barrel. At the height of a barrel, this would be the area he would see at the height of a barrel. And again, you see what he would see in his mirrors, and you actually see what he cannot see, which would be the gray areas. And the third, this is actually what he sees at the height of a normal person, roughly a 5-foot person. So clearly, you can see with these blind spots, actually, you can teach someone on the ground what the driver or operator can or cannot see as it relates to the equipment having these massive blind spots. Also, at the bottom of this slide, there is a link to the NIOSH website. The NIOSH has actually developed probably about 40 different blind spots for different types of equipment. So you could actually go to the NIOSH website and get additional blind spot diagrams for additional equipment that you don't see here. So again, very important in terms of teaching workers where not to stand, what the operator or the driver sees or does not see. Okay, we can go back. Okay, on the second blind spot demo, again, what we see is an operator's cab on a piece of equipment, and we see a person in the back of the equipment. We can move this person, and clearly the person can move back and forward behind the equipment. The operator cannot see the person, but as the person starts to move sideways, the person would actually come in view of the operator's mirror. And at some point they go out of view of the operator's mirror. But again, excellent diagram to show people that the operator cannot see you unless you're in certain positions around the equipment, and what positions to actually stay out of around the equipment. But again, the blind spot demonstration is very effective in teaching workers on foot what operators and drivers can and cannot see. Okay, again, this slide gets into additional devices to actually assist in eliminating blind spots like cameras, sonar devices, radar devices, and tag systems. Next slide. Now, why do we use backup alarms? And again, this slide gets into details on the advantages of using backup alarms and actually what we get by using the backup alarms. Okay, next slide. Why must we learn about temporary traffic control devices? We must understand use, spacing, maintaining barrels, cones, tubular devices. And it gets into pros and cons on using these devices. And at the bottom, we talk about the barriers, the concrete movable water-filled barriers, and advantages and disadvantages on this equipment. Okay, what is a spotter? Spotters warn operators about nearby workers and hazards. If you're a spotter, make sure operators know your position, workers know your responsibilities, workers do not move behind equipment until you signal permission from the operator or driver. Spotters must be trained in safe procedures, including continuous visibility and contact with the operator. Very important. In a lot of cases, we'll assign someone to be a spotter without proper training, without properly knowing the blind spots, without properly knowing their responsibilities. And what this slide is, spotters are very important in the site, but if they're not properly trained, they can be a hazard in the site. Next slide. What are the best general safety tips? And again, we give general check surroundings often, listen for warnings, never work impaired by alcohol, drugs, medication, or any substance that makes you less alert. Make sure you get enough sleep, rest before starting your shift. Look out for each other and warn coworkers. Now, at the bottom of this page, you'll see a number of areas where you can actually take the slides in this section and actually take the slides that might impact the operator or the driver. We can also take the slides that would actually lay out contractor responsibilities, so we can literally teach a given audience using this. But for this, we're going to actually go to the agency owner responsibilities. And if you were to click on one and look at the sign, you'll see the language on the sign change. 2, 3. So in other words, it's telling you that you can actually use signs to actually assist in warning motorists. Next slide. How do we prevent runovers by motorists? And again, we talk about a number of different ways where we can actually help enhance the work zone, but I think the main thing here I want to show is a demo where they actually show dynamic lane merging. And this is a different concept that a lot of contractors under certain circumstances can consider. Okay, next slide. What about positive separation? Okay, we have a number of demos here. Here is a brochure that actually talks about positive separation. And you can actually, and by the way, all of the brochures and booklets we've shown you are printable, and a lot of the material is printable not only in English, but it's printable in Spanish and or Portuguese. Some of the brochures are only English, but again, most of the information is printable in multi-languages. Okay, 2, this is one of my favorite, the demos here. It shows a lot of the items from Subpart K and a lot of the regulations that might impact you in setting up or maintaining the work zone. 3, this is one of my favorite demos showing an attenuator, use of an attenuator. Watch closely. This demo is good to show workers why they should not be in front of or around an attenuator that's actually working in traffic. And here you see that the motorist was actually using his laptop computer while driving. But again, this little video actually is very important to show workers why the attenuator is there and why they should not be around that attenuator when they're actually working. Next. And here, they actually show a number of applications in terms of how to set up the attenuator and the work zone. So again, the program is loaded with a lot of things that you can actually use to train workers, train supervisors, and how to set up work zones, how to maintain work zones, and why you do certain things. What else can owners, agencies do? And again, these are the regulations. But again, you get a pretty good, and this talks about Subpart K, but you get a pretty good overview of how versatile the program is in terms of assisting you in maintaining safe work zones, how to properly set up work zones. And with that, I will bring up the next speaker.
Good afternoon. Morning, I guess, still. Not quite noon yet. Okay, can everybody hear me well in the back? Okay, great. Let me know if you, at some point, stop being able to hear me back there. This is a module that was developed based off some guidance that the consortium is also developing, dealing with setting speed limits in work zones and managing speeds in work zones. This, unfortunately, is not on the CD you received today because it will be incorporated into later editions, and we're working on finalizing this module and then finalizing the guidance through FHWA. So today I'm briefly just going to pull some of the slides out for you to look at so you get a flavor for some of the discussions we're going to cover. Now, just so I know my audience a little bit better today, how many of you are with a public agency, say a state DOT? Can you show me your hands? Okay, great. So a lot of people here. And how many contractors do we have in the audience? Okay, just a few. What are some of the others? More counties? Consultants? Insurance. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Okay, well, we may have a couple of differing opinions in the audience today. It's always interesting to hear the side that we have to balance motorists, mobility, and safety going through a work zone, as well as worker safety and concerns. And motorists obviously want to go very fast through your work zone, and workers a lot of times want them to go at a very slow pace. And we have to balance that so that both sides are safe, but we also don't forget about mobility. So just some basics here today that a lot of you, especially if you're with public agencies, will know. But again, this could be used to explain some of these concepts to workers in the field that may not be as knowledgeable about why we do the things we do as engineers. So how are the motorists just told to slow down? Well, in work zones, a lot of times we will ask for a reduced regulatory speed limit, okay? That's enforceable by a citation from an enforcement officer. And usually they're controlled by some kind of state law on what those reductions can be from your normal posted speed limit. Okay? They also, according to the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices, should typically only be reduced by 10 miles an hour. Now again, some states do vary that maximum reduction based on their own policies and standards, but that is a recommended practice from the MUTCD. Now we can also use advisory speed plaques. Okay, these would be posted underneath your warning signs in a specific location. Say you're taking one direction of traffic over into the other direction, so you've built a temporary crossover. You might want to put even a lower speed there with an advisory speed plaque in that isolated location to warn motorists of a proper speed to take that S-curve. Okay, these are definitely regulated also by your DOT's internal policies. Mouse keeps moving, I'm sorry. Basically, the goal is to really just to identify a safe and reasonable speed, as I kind of indicated earlier today. There we go. Okay, so the next question is, when do we need slower speeds in a work zone? Okay. We want slower speeds in a work zone if it improves motorist and worker safety, okay? What this basically means is there needs to be a good reason out there, a hazardous condition, for us to reduce the speed limit. Typically, this means that we have, what the number one people think of as workers on foot. I have workers on foot, they're only protected by cones and barrels. No positive protection. Well, of course, we'd like our motorists to slow down because we have people right next to that live traffic. Another instance would be some kind of restriction, whether that be the work operation itself, say in a mobile kind of lane closure, or a stationary lane closure, temporary crossover, etc. We would want to maybe have some kind of reduced speed in that situation. But we don't always need reduced speeds, okay? They may not be needed if we have adequate lane width and space for the public to travel on the road and our workers are behind positive protection. Okay? And there's no other kind of hazard out there. In those scenarios, we could most likely let the public go ahead and travel through at the current normal posted speed limit. Another condition that we're hearing a lot of, especially with respect to public kind of acceptance and frustration, is if we have a work zone out there where we've had a lane closure during the day, but when our work operation leaves and the road is back to normal, that reduced speed limit sign should be put away because, again, you have removed the hazard that necessitated that reduced work zone speed limit. So there's a lot of things to consider with reducing the speed limit, okay? And again, you can see here just kind of the overall goal of this slide. Okay, so then that last kind of scenario comes to the question of when should we then keep our reduced speed limits or advisories in place. Okay. Basically, only when the hazard is still present. Now, again, this could be the physical work itself, or if you have some kind of roadway restriction like a temporary crossover or a stationary lane closure that's going to be in place 24/7 because of a long-term construction project. Okay. If we don't, we can actually have some negative consequences that can impact our work zone safety, both from the motor side and from the worker side. And I'm just going to kind of show you by clicking through these. I won't read each of these, but you can understand why these would happen and why then that could decrease the safety in the overall work zone. So it's important for workers to understand that if we do leave up signs that aren't necessary, there can be negative impacts to their safety. Okay. So in order to maintain credibility, we need to either cover or remove those signs if they're not needed anymore. When they're in effect, we should make sure and enforce them, especially as I'm going to talk about in a little bit about how we get motorists to actually slow down. And then we can also use public relations campaigns to really explain to the public why they need to slow down and to let them know that there's going to be enforcement. Okay, so if we need to change the speed limit, okay, this can actually be a very cumbersome task. Okay, let's just think about a daily operation. You'd be setting up signs every day, covering your existing signs every day. Maybe it's a weekly basis, but there are some safety concerns with that as well. You have workers on foot, obviously changing out these traffic control devices. Okay, so there are some new technologies that we're seeing in the market, and I just wanted to briefly describe those to you today. They include a device that's been used some in Illinois and around the Midwest, which is just a static regulatory speed limit sign that has flashing beacons, similar to a school zone that would have flashing beacons where that speed is reduced only during certain times of the day. And those beacons would be on then, and then that speed limit would be in effect. When you go to leave the work zone, you would turn that off. Of course, with any devices, even covering or removing, you do have to remove to do that component. Remember to do that component. Some items that we've looked at in Texas were some roll-up speed limit signs. So on your more mobile operations or your real temporary ones that maybe only last an hour or two in a location that use roll-up warning signs, you could use this as well, because a lot of times historically in Texas, those may be operations that we haven't requested reduced work zone speed limits for, but that's where you really have the conditions of workers on the pavement next to live traffic that in Texas's case is typically going 70, 75 miles an hour. The last one I wanted to mention to you is known a lot as variable message signs or variable speed limit signs. Now these can be used in two ways. Traditionally, they've been tested out to where they actually react to traffic. And so if you start having congestion, they may lower the speed limit or raise the speed limit appropriately. Recently in Texas, we actually just tested them to give us more ability to change that speed limit. So we were out in an area, we had a work zone that was divided into 3 sections depending on the day, and as the phasing progressed, where the main work was occurring and where they needed that speed reduction, we could use these devices to only reduce the speed in the needed area and then be able to change that back to the normal posted speed limit without having to cover or remove the coverings on the permanent signs and then just having one sign that would show multiple speed limits. So that is another kind of innovative way to use that technology if you don't want it really fully activated. Now the main, whoops, I clicked off that, I'm sorry, Rod. Okay, thank you. My mouse is slippery on this podium. The main limitation, and just to remember, is if you're interested in using some of these technologies, check with your state laws and regulations. For instance, Texas cannot use the first one I mentioned because our state law says that the work zone speed limits must be removed or covered, which means we can't use this flashing on and off lights device. So just keep that in mind. Some of them, too, are still in the experimental stages, so you might want to kind of see how research is progressing on those. But did want to let you know they are out there. Okay, so something to talk about sometimes with workers is, do drivers voluntarily slow down? If they're not, how do we get them to do that? Typically, motorists, we all know, will only slow down if they perceive a need to do so. What this means for us is if we've set a reduced work zone speed limit and there's no immediate work in the vicinity, people are not going to react to this, okay? That's something we've shown in research. They see the speed limit sign, they understand it, but until they physically see something they need to slow down for, they're not going to do that. So in cases where you're really worried about safety and you'd like the motorist to be going at least maybe within 5 miles an hour of your posted reduced work zone speed limit, you might need to consider some other speed management techniques. Okay. I'm not going to, there is some information here about law enforcement. We're all very aware that law enforcement is the #1 way for you to achieve some sort of compliance. Typically, speed reductions are in the 10-mile-an-hour range. We do see upwards of 15 and 20 in some cases. Okay. We can't have enforcement everywhere, though. It's expensive. They actually can't do their job in some locations. Here we're at a bridge conference. It's very hard for police to position themselves, chase down speeders, and then issue citations in restricted areas. So sometimes the limitations of the workspace itself don't really allow a enforcement presence. So we have to think of some other techniques. Okay, so quickly, I'm just going to kind of click through some of these, and then I'll briefly explain them for some of you that may not be familiar with all of them. The first is driver feedback devices. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with what we call speed display trailers. Shows the posted speed limit as well as the speed the driver is going. Along with enforcement, these are very effective. If enforcement is not present or present all the time, remember to move them around some. That keeps people on their toes a little bit more. Another version of that concept can be done with portable changeable message signs, okay, if that's what you have available. CB radios have also been used in work zones with high amounts of truck volume, okay? You see that the typical decrease in speeds is not very high here, but it also alerts them to the presence, so they're more cognizant of the fact that there may be slow traffic or congestion, which also improves the safety of the work zone. There's also several perceptual methods that can be used to slow down traffic. And you'll notice as I go through these, I'm not reading the speed decreases, but they are here for you to be able to kind of compare what you might receive as far as speed reductions if you utilize these types of technologies. Okay, transverse rumble strips can be placed across the road as maybe you're approaching a flagger station to alert the driver and to get them to slow down as they approach a potential stop condition. Drone radar has been used in some work zones. It basically sends out a signal like an enforcement officer would for those that have radar detectors, and then can have those people slow down. Again, that's an isolated population you're trying to target, just like with the CB radio, but it can be effective if you have a large population with those devices. Narrowing the lanes, again, I mentioned you could do that just if your construction calls for narrow lanes to be able to have more workspace with positive protection, but you can also do that with barrels or cones as well, kind of limit that width of that roadway. And lastly, you can use kind of a new concept, which is just transverse pavement markings. There's a wide range of research and even some information in the new 2009 MUTCD on markings that can be used that as drivers go through them, perceptually it makes them slow down because they get a feeling that they're going too fast. Okay, and there's more information, like I said, out there in research or in the MUTCD on that. Okay, that's all I have for the day. There is some other tools that are mentioned, and then there's a guidance section in this demo that will walk you through some guidance. We developed a decision tool to help you kind of go through, do I reduce my speed limit? Do I use a speed management technique? Am I going to gain the reductions I want? A very nice flow chart, and this module will also step you through that. I'm not going to go through that today for lack of time, but this is the guidelines that hopefully will be released here in the next few weeks. FHWA is reviewing the final copy right now. Will be available on the Workzone Clearinghouse, and if you're really interested and would like me to get you a copy, feel free to hand me your business card after today, and as soon as it's released, I'll be able to provide that link to you for you to be able to download that. Thank you very much.